All right, everyone, this is chapter 10. We've kind of been beating around the bush here with chapter 10, going back and forth with biotech and future of food and agriculture. So let's kind of go over some of this. I think we only got to 10 slides in period 3, so that's where we're going to go in this. That's our goal for this session. Okay, so part of the problem with of course, providing for all people on Earth is how much food do we have? And we're always having more and more people. The population is still growing at an exponential rate. So, but yet, because there's inequality, you end up with not only undernourishment, like in countries, and developing countries, but you also have overnutrition, okay, overnourishment in countries like the United States. So which is why you see here that in the U.S., 25% of adults are obese. That number is still very large. Remember, this information from the text is about from 2008, so it's a little outdated. So this number could still be much higher than it was in 2008. Okay, so obesity is a problem, but at the same time, while people have an overabundance of food, eating too much food, having way too many calories in their diet, of course, there are those in countries that are underdeveloped. Those are the more impoverished nations in the world, are undernourished and by definition, they're receiving less than 90% of their daily caloric needs. Okay, and again, mostly it's for economic reasons. Don't have enough money to buy the proper foods to maintain a healthy diet. All right, and then you have malnutrition, which in general is a shortage of nutrients the body needs. The diet lacks adequate vitamins and minerals. So maybe someone who is getting enough food, getting enough calories, but they can also be malnourished. So maybe they're not hungry, but they might be malnourished in the sense that they might be eating food that has all carbs and all fat and very little fiber, very little, having little of the essential vitamins that the bodies don't produce. So a person can be very well nourished, okay, meaning like having the caloric intake appropriate for a person, but might lack those essential vitamins and minerals that people get from food, right? So you can be getting enough food, but not having the right nutrition. All right. So quantity and quality of food is important. So these are two specific examples of conditions that result when humans don't get enough food or the appropriate nutrients from their diets. So kwashiorkor is kind of when you see those like little kids in those kind of those infomercials that want you to donate to hungry children in impoverished nations, where they have that kind of bloated stomach, which can also lead to bloated stomach, which is a physical manifestation of malnutrition. So it's kind of like it's counterintuitive. So it looks like they have like chubby little bellies, but they're just bloated. And so that's not a result of having too much fat in their diet. And then also you have mental and physical disabilities that result from not having the proper nutrition as they age and grow up. So right, for example, like if kids can't go through any kind of growth spurts without the proper nutrition, without the proper nutrients, so in that sense, you end up with a shorter population. So they say that in North Korea, for example, that the average height of a North Korean is actually shorter than a South Korean, and mostly that's because, contrary to what Kim Jong Un and the Kim Jong Il said or have said in the past, that they're providing all the nutrients and food for their population, is probably not true. Okay, so you do end up with these physical manifestations of not having the appropriate diet. And then marasmus is wasting or shriveling of the body when you're protein deficient and insufficient calories. So these are just two important keywords to know. Just to know that these two conditions have to do with malnutrition and undernourishment. All right, so monocultures, this is something humans over time have become very good at. So planting, basically monoculture is planting one kind of species of a crop. For example, like fields of wheat would be a monoculture, fields of corn, fields of soybeans. So whenever we take one kind of food and plant very large, expansive fields of it and for harvest and for use, it's known as a monoculture. Okay, it decreases biodiversity. It leaves those fields susceptible to disease and pests. So think back to when we talked about population dynamics, when individuals of a species, when they're very, very closely grouped together, they're more susceptible, more vulnerable to disease because of that close proximity. Okay, so this practice also narrows the human diet. 90% of our food comes from 15 crop species and eight livestock species. So the diversity of our diet is actually pretty limited. We're used to eating a lot of the same thing. You might consider soy. Soy is in almost everything. If you look at the ingredients of the food that you get from the grocery store, or even on the back of chips, you see that a lot of it has a lot of soy meal, or like there's a lot of soy-based products in that. So I mean, that's kind of bad luck for people who are allergic to soy, because it's basically in everything. All right, resistance to pesticides. This is thinking back to kind of evolution, this evolutionary arms race, when we have so we have a swarm of these locusts or maybe grasshoppers, and they attack this field and they get sprayed with the pesticide, and the pesticide kills almost all of them except for a few. And these few grasshoppers, these pests, are special in that they have some kind of genetic abnormality in comparison to the rest of the population that allows them to survive, to be resistant to the pesticide that's being applied. So those survive, end up reproducing, and pass on the genes to the next generations. And then you end up with a swarm full of pesticide-resistant insects. So when it's applied again, the pesticide has very, very little effect, and they either have to develop new or more toxic pesticides in order to combat the pests. All right. So biological control. So instead of using chemicals and toxic pesticides, you can also use a pest natural predator against it. So one of the examples that they give in the textbook is the cactus moths being used to control the prickly pear. So the cactus moths like to eat the prickly pear. They eat it. So they feed on that so much that they decimate the population. Which, if you're trying to control the prickly pear population density in an area, that's great. Okay, so that you're using the biological, I wouldn't say predator, okay, predator of an organism against it. So without using chemicals, you can use the natural predator of something to reduce its numbers. Okay, so this BT, if you remember from the documentary that we were watching about food choices, when one of the contributors was talking about the BT toxin. She was like freaking out about it. So BT toxin is this Bacillus thuringiensis, hard to say. So this kind of bacteria actually produces a natural pesticide. So this bacteria produces the BT toxin, which is a kind of it's a crystalline chemical, okay, that the bacteria produces, and if ingested by an insect, it does a lot of harm to the insect, so much that it kills it. So okay, so this bacteria can produce this molecule, okay, that is able to kill many pests. Okay, and so then you think about, okay, well, how can we give that ability, okay, from the bacteria to a plant? Okay, well, then you got to think. This bacteria how does it know how to make that? Well, then the answer, of course, is in its genes. So in its genes, there's some kind of genetic information encoded in DNA, which gets transcribed into mRNA, which gets translated into amino acids, so the proteins, and so think back to bio. So if we can isolate that gene, then we can put it into plants, into the plant genome. So when those seeds are produced, every cell in the seed that will eventually grow into the plant has this gene to produce the Bt toxin. So now you're giving the ability to make the toxin from the bacteria to the plants. Now the plants, every cell has this toxin, so the plant's now toxic to pests. Okay, and we'll come back to that later. But so anyway, biocontrol agents may become a problem as well, because once you release that biocontrol agent, so that predator species, you're not really sure about what are the other effects going to be. You have non-target effects. The target effect would have been the cactus moths eating the prickly pears, but the non-target effect would be the moths eating rare Florida cacti, right? Not intentional. So they didn't introduce cactus moths to eat all the cacti, just one. So so some of those unforeseen effects are called non-target effects. And part of what makes it difficult is that once you introduce this cactus moth, how are you going to remove it? If it becomes a problem, what are you going to do? Like introduce the predator of the predator. So now you have an organism eating an organism that you introduced to eat another organism. So this kind of cascade of problems where you're introducing the predator of the predator of the predator. All right. So but if you're using pesticide, all you have to do is stop using it. So there's kind of trade-offs. Okay, and this all goes into this idea called integrated pest management, or IPM. Okay, so all of these techniques are used to suppress pests. So used in combination depending on the situation. Okay, so we'll have to go a little bit more in depth on integrated pest management later. But like we talked about biocontrol, right, introducing the predator of the pest, chemicals like pesticides, population monitoring, habitat alteration, crop rotation and transgenic crops. So those are the GMOs. Okay, alternative tillage methods. Tillage basically is in the practice of overturning the topsoil, and usually the goal of that is to kill the weeds and remove the weeds. The problem with tilling and with intensive tillage is that you start to break up that the community that is the soil. So remember, the soil is almost like a living community itself of living things. So not only is it like the dirt and the rocks, but it's also, and also the ions and those different nutrients. But it's also a community of different microbes and different fungi and different plant roots and things that hold it together. Okay, so when you think about soil, you want the soil to be held together very tightly by the fungus and by the roots and all those things, because if it's not, then hopefully you're thinking about this already, is that soil is going to be much more susceptible to erosion. When there's more erosion, the nutrients leave, right? Think about the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl was a result of overtilling the land in the Midwestern United States. Okay, so all that land was overtilled, was so loose and was so loose that once that wind came in, it just blew the nutrients away. So now the Midwestern agriculture regions are much less productive than they were in the pre-Dust Bowl era. All right, and then mechanical pest removal would be like setting up traps, capturing those pests. Okay, so a combination of these things might be used to suppress pests. Okay, now pollinators. Hopefully we have an idea what pollinators are. So we've been talking about how we're using pesticides to kill insects. Okay, so yes, some insects are bad, but some insects are also not only good, but they're vital. They're essential. Without them, plants cannot reproduce. They can't spread their genes. Right. So pollination is when you have that male sex cell fertilizing the female sex cells. Usually it's by wind, but a lot of times by animals. So that's honeybees, right? Going from flower to flower and gathering nectar, but at the same time, that flower is also kind of putting some of the pollen onto the plant. So onto the bee, so the bee takes that pollen over to the next flower over, or maybe it could be a flower miles away. We don't know. All right. So pollinators, hummingbirds, bats, insects, bats, because they sometimes they're looking for nectar too. And so anytime an animal gets so close to the inside of a flower where that pollen gets deposited onto its feathers or its fur or its body in any way, is a form of pollination. So flowers are an evolutionary adaptation to attract pollinators. So when you see a flower that has very bright, vibrant petals, a very beautiful exterior look, that's just a result of evolution to attract the pollinators. Also, think about this. The way we see flowers might actually be different than the way a bee might see them, because they see the world not in maybe visible light, but they might see in ultraviolet light, or they might see it in ways that we can't interpret the world. So, but generally, if we see a brightly colored flower, it's because it's adapted to attract those the pollinators. Okay, last slide. So for today, is the conservation of pollinators is crucial, okay, to the survival of plants, and honestly, not just to survival of plants themselves, but for us too. It's because honeybees pollinate more than 100 crops, or a third of the U.S. diet. So, so in 2006, many hives died off. They just, whatever environmental conditions that bees are used to or adapted to. You remember? So in terms of so if we are facing extinction, it's because the environment is changing so rapidly that these insects, bees, for example, they just don't have enough time to adapt. They don't have enough time for that natural selection to act in the way that it should over millions of years. So then the question is, why is it changing? Is this a climate change thing? Are we changing the temperature and the seasonality of what honeybees are used to? Because now we see that flowers are either blooming too late or too soon compared to average. So so one way we would think about is how to conserve bees is to reduce or eliminate pesticide use, which part of that might be using some GMOs, right? Because bees aren't going to physically eat those plants. Okay, but we might reduce or eliminate pesticide use, or make them more specific. If I don't know how that would happen, but if you made them somehow exclude the bees, that the bees are immune to this pesticide, something to reduce the amount of death caused by the pesticides on the bees, and also just planting flowering plants, right? So that's something that all of us could do around our home or in our school or in a community, is to plant flowering plants, because the more flowering plants there are, the more bees you will generally have. Same thing for like monarch butterflies. Monarch butterflies need milkweed. So if you plant more milkweed, there will be more there will be more monarch butterflies, because there are selected. Okay, so we're going to stop there for today. So hopefully you are paying attention and took some good notes, and we will continue at some of the point.